I need a black wife, and you need a man. The words dropped into the stillness of a dry willow afternoon like a stone into a glassy pond, sending ripples across the porch rail, the fence line, and straight through the heart of the woman standing beneath the eaves. Clara Wren, widowed nearly 4 years, kept working the dry bean pods from their stems, pausing only for the briefest beat. In this town, folks were used to looking at her with sidelong glances or pity, whispering behind her back as if her skin color and the absence of a wedding band were reason enough to push her outside the borders of belonging. From the red dirt road came the slow, measured rhythm of hooves, carrying a man near 7 feet tall, shoulders as broad as a barn door, eyes deep enough to have measured the whole world before resting on her. There was no smile, no polite greeting, only that blunt declaration, the kind no one in Dry Willow had ever spoken to Clara. And in that moment, the pale gold afternoon shifted its hue. The afternoon in Dry Willow felt as if it had been kept inside a painting that had hung too long on the wall. Autumn sunlight no longer carried the sharp edge of summer, nor had it yet faded into the weakness of winter. It simply spread into a thin, pale gold, soaking into every weathered grain of the porch boards. The dirt road running from the center of town to Clara Wren's home saw almost no travelers at this hour. Only now and then would a light breeze pass through, brushing against the dry grass along the fence line before moving on, leaving behind a near absolute stillness. Clara stood beneath the porch eaves, a light shawl draped over her shoulders, her hands stripping the last of the summer's bean pods from their strings. Her fingers knew the work so well she didn't need to look. Only the crisp snap of the pods told her the seeds had dropped into the basket. The dry, earthy scent of beans mingled with the old wood smell of the porch bench and the loamy soil beneath her feet, making the porch a safe territory, one where time moved only to the rhythm of her hands. Her gaze would drift now and then toward the fields ahead. From here, the rows of corn stood bare after harvest, only dry stalks left leaning toward the wind like tired silhouettes. Beyond them stretched a sweep of prairie all the way to the foot of the hills, where sunlight was holding fast to the last golden strips of the day. No wheels on the road, no voices calling from afar. Dry Willow, at this hour, was a place that neither needed anyone to come nor cared if anyone left. Yet that stillness was broken, lightly, almost imperceptibly, by a change only someone who had lived here long would notice. The sun on the road ahead lost a measure of its light, not from a cloud, but from a shadow drawing closer. At first it was only a moving speck on the horizon, half swallowed by the fine dust kicked up with each hoof-fall. Then it grew, sharpened with every measured step. The horse appeared first, black-coated, broad-chested, moving slowly, yet with a certainty that said both rider and animal knew they had more time than most. Nearing the fence line, the horse's hooves met the packed dirt in a steady rhythm, sending a muted vibration into the ground beneath Clara's bare feet. The man atop it made the animal seem smaller, not for lack of the horse's strength, but because he was near 7 feet tall, shoulders broad as barn doors, his frame filling the saddle. His shadow reached from the road all the way up the porch steps, swallowing the worn shoes on Clara's feet into darkness. She kept working the beans, though her fingers slowed each time the sunlight dimmed a fraction more. The pale gold now carried the gray of stirred-up dust, along with the scents of horsehide and the dried sweat of a long ride. The horse stopped a few paces short of the fence, its breath sending thin white streams into the cool air. The man did not dismount. He kept his place in the saddle, one broad hand resting on the reins. long sun-browned fingers, nails trimmed short, but roughened by heavy work. The westering light caught on the line of his jaw beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Most of his face stayed hidden, save for the eyes, lit just enough to reveal a depth of watching, as though measuring every detail. The weathered porch, the basket of beans, the stance of the woman working there. There was no greeting, no circling preamble. His voice came, low, solid, dropping into the air with the weight of a stone into a still pond. I need a black wife, and you need a man. It didn't tear through the afternoon like a gunshot, but spread instead in slow ripples, touching everything. The strings of beans hanging from the eaves, the grass by the fence, the bowed cornstalks in the distance, and Clara's heart, which had taught itself to lie calm after years of widowhood and cold seasons. She didn't answer right away. Her hands kept their motion, though a few beans slipped free, rolling down the porch step to rest there. Her gaze moved, across the breadth of chest beneath a coarse workshirt, down to the boots coated in the red dust of far-off miles. All of it was unfamiliar, unexpected, yet none of it explained why this man stood here now with words like that for an opening. From behind the house came the mixed scent of dry hay and damp earth, familiar enough that Clara clung to it, as though it were a rope keeping her tethered to the present. The horse shook its head, mane falling down its neck, and exhaled slowly, as if it too knew it held the full attention of the moment. She stooped, picked up the fallen beans, and dropped them into the basket. The small act kept her hands busy, if not her thoughts. The words still echoed, not for their boldness, but for their absolute lack of hesitation. They had the feel of something long decided, now simply placed in front of her, waiting to see if she would pick it up or leave it be. Over the years, Clara had met enough sidelong looks and half-meant words. In this town, people might smile at her in the market, yet step back when she drew near. They would sell her salt, soap, whatever she needed, but their eyes lingered too long on her hands, as if checking for traces of where they'd been. So a direct statement, from a stranger no less, shook her more than the subtlest insult. The afternoon shadows stretched, covering all the ground before the porch. The wind returned, this time carrying the faint smoke of a far-off fire. Through that drifting haze, the figure of Elias Kane, though she didn't yet know his name, remained motionless, as though he too was waiting for something from her. But she gave him nothing. Not yet. Off in the distance, the last light of the day slanted, sweeping across old fence lines, rooftops, and the brittle fields. Clara adjusted her shawl, then turned back to her basket. Each bean falling into it made the softest sound, threading itself between the unmoving rhythm of the horse's hooves. No one spoke another word, yet both of them knew the air of this afternoon had shifted, and likely so had the days to come. Clara didn't answer. Her lips pressed together as if whatever words might have formed never found their way out, folding back into her own thoughts instead. She pulled the shawl closer around her shoulders, the motion slow yet certain, like a person drawing the heavier blanket up in the middle of a cold night. The edge of the fabric brushed lightly against the skin at the hollow of her throat. A small touch, but enough to make her aware that her hand was cold. Her fingers held the edge longer than necessary. It was the way she always built an invisible wall between herself and whatever pressed in from the outside. Not wood, not stone, but a caution worn into her over years, a defense as real as any she could count on in Dry Willow. Her gaze drifted away from the stranger's face, most of it shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, and settled on his boots, heavy with the weight of red dust. Not the dust of roads around town. This was thicker, older, the kind that clung after long miles through parched country. The stitching on the leather had faded with wear, the edges curled stiff, but the seams still held. The mark of a man who took care of the few things he carried. Since the day her husband died of fever, Clara had learned to stand on her own before everything. The night winds clawing at the roof, the planting seasons starved of rain, the moments when a shopkeeper refused credit simply because of who she was. In Dry Willow, the memory of a man who died young faded faster than the paint on the church walls. But his widow remained in the town's mind, like a mark no one wanted to touch, yet no one erased. She had become the ink stain others avoided looking at directly. Sometimes they would smile when they passed her in the market, but their eyes slid away too quickly to be honest. They would sell her salt, soap, a few yards of cloth, but their nod always came with a small, unconscious step back, as if that space was part of some unspoken ritual to keep the order this town knew too well. In time, such things stopped hurting the way they once had. They became like calluses on her hands, raw at first, then thickening until one day she almost forgot they were there. Almost, until someone brushed against them, and she remembered they still existed, silent but never gone. The man before her, Elias Kane, a name never once passed in any Dry Willow conversation, sat straight in the saddle, his big hand resting on the reins, with the ease of someone who had spent more life on horseback than under a roof. His back was straight, steady, as though he could wait there for hours just to hear her answer. His eyes, though shadowed by the brim, carried something that made Clara feel more seen than she wanted. Not the blunt curiosity of a stranger, not the high-handed judgment of one taking measure. It was more like a carpenter's eye on a plank of wood, marking each grain, each split, missing nothing. The look was neither hurried nor shy. It simply stayed, whole and unflinching. A light breeze crossed the yard, carrying the damp earth scent from the garden she had just turned for the next planting. It also caught a few strands of hair loose from her bun, winding them around her neck and cheek. Clara didn't lift a hand to brush them away, letting them catch against her lips and shawl. The sensation was strange and familiar at once, like the faint memory of days when there had been someone else to do it for her. Neither of them moved. Time here was slow already, but now it seemed to drop another gear, each second falling like water dripping from the porch eaves into a tin pail. Clara didn't know what might break this stillness. A word, a step, or simply the choice of one of them to leave. From the far fields, a meadowlark burst from the grass, its wings beating a sharp whisper before it disappeared behind the willows. The sound pulled Clara's eyes from his boots, but not from the weight of his gaze. He was still there, unmoving, like a boulder that had always been in the riverbed, now laid bare as the water receded. To be seen completely, not through the lens of prejudice, nor through the mask of polite distance, unsettled Clara more than she'd expected. For years, she'd perfected the balance of her presence, warm enough not to be called cold, distant enough to avoid questions. Elias Kane's eyes thinned those boundaries. He didn't look away, didn't press, didn't fidget. That patience, instead of feeling like respect, made her uneasy because it told her he could wait as long as it took to get what he wanted. And somehow, Clara knew she was already among those things. Overhead, the last of the daylight tilted west, casting a pale gold across the old fence lines, the resting fields, and finally the weathered porch. Clara drew in a long breath, smoke and earth mingling in her chest. She didn't answer, didn't turn away. Instead, she bent to pick up a few beans that had slipped from her hand, letting them fall back into the basket. No one said another word. Yet both of them, in their own way, knew. The air of this afternoon had changed, and from here, the days ahead might not be the same again. Elias did not appear the next day. The following morning, Clara went out to the fields as usual, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth after a night of dew. The sky was clearer, sunlight slanting through thin clouds, illuminating every speck of dust drifting above the cleared corn rows. No strange footprints led into the yard. No tall shadow fell across the gate as it had the afternoon before. But when she returned from the fields, she noticed something different. The stretch of northern fence, where the last season's winds had left an entire section leaning, now stood straight again. The old rails had been braced with new posts, nailed firm. The earth at their base was freshly turned, carrying the scent of green-cut pine, as if a pair of hands had left it only hours earlier. The next day, a sack of seed corn appeared beside the wooden step. No note, no string tied around the mouth, just left there, as though whoever brought it knew the owner would understand. The kernels were full, bright gold, carrying the warm scent of a freshly opened granary. Clara paused for a moment before lifting it, feeling not only the weight of the grain, but the weight of someone's unseen presence. Another afternoon, after a brief midday shower, Clara stepped onto the porch to find her rain barrel moved, shifted to the exact spot where the porch eaves dripped the heaviest. The barrel was already half full, the water clear enough to mirror the clouds overhead. She remembered placing it somewhere else where it had never caught much, yet now it sat exactly where it needed to be, as if someone had quietly studied the wind's habits and the roof's runoff. These changes came without announcement. No knock at the door, no warning, no scrap of paper to explain. Nothing bore a name, no sign of pride. Each thing was placed exactly where it belonged, as though it had always been there. Clara didn't need to see who had done it to know. In the precision, just enough, solid, nothing wasted, she recognized the hand of Elias Kane. She began watching more closely in the mornings. In the damp soil, sometimes there was a faint crescent of a hoof print, half formed and half erased, heading toward the edge of the woods. Some days, alongside the hoof print, there was the deep impression of a large boot, pressed in as if the wearer had stood there a long while before moving on. She never caught him there, yet those traces felt like greetings sent from a distance, never asking for an answer, but always arriving. Clara told no one, not because she meant to keep a secret, but because she knew if she spoke of it, the town would turn it into another story, adding pieces, trimming others, attaching meanings that didn't belong. To her, the traces required no explanation. They simply were, and somehow they made the ground around her home feel less empty. One late afternoon, while gathering hay in the yard, a last beam of sunlight slipped through the willows and lit something at the base of the fence, a coil of new rope, thick, smelling of fresh hemp. No one from town would have brought such a thing, and she hadn't ordered it. She picked it up, feeling the solid twist of the fibers in her hands. and unbidden, the image of a tall figure standing on her porch came back to her. These touches, if they could be called that, took no shape of meeting. There were no exchanged glances, no words passed. They existed as a chain of actions, leaving marks that asked for nothing in return. Each time she came upon one, Clara would pause for a few seconds, letting herself feel the quiet behind it, the presence of someone who understood that sometimes distance was worth more than inquiry. She made no move to seek him out, not because she didn't want to, but because it felt as though things were unfolding at the pace they were meant to. If a man could straighten a fence, set a barrel just right, and choose seed without a single bad kernel, he could wait until it was time to be seen again. Every morning when she opened the door, Clara glanced over the yard, not quite searching, not quite not. These small changes became part of her daily rhythm, as natural as the wind at the window or the porch boards creaking in the cold. They didn't disrupt. They simply made the space around her less desolate. Now and then, in the middle of her work, she would stop and look toward the dirt road leading out of town. It remained quiet, with only the occasional puff of dust rising and dissolving in the wind. Yet even without seeing, she sometimes felt something, like the faintest echo of hoofbeats, too far to hear, yet near enough to slow her heart. And so, without a word, without a single meeting, a thin current formed between them. It needed no name. It simply existed, like water running beneath dry ground, unseen but keeping certain roots alive. That night, the wind shifted from the northwest, carrying the dry scent of the prairie and a chill that slipped through every seam of the wooden house. Clara was stacking firewood along the wall when a strange flicker of light near the creek's edge caught her eye. At first, she thought it might be moonlight glancing off the water, but as she watched, she saw the glow swell and fade, like the breathing of a small flame in the dark. The creek lay only a few hundred steps from the house, hidden behind a stand of willows and thick sage. At this hour, no one ever went there. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was dense and low, the wind across the grass sounding like rough cloth being twisted. Beneath her feet, the earth was damp, and the smell of wet weeds clung to the hem of her skirt. As she drew nearer, the sound of running water wove itself between the sighing wind. A faint thread of wood smoke drifted past, slow burning, warm rather than sharp. She followed the narrow track along the bank, careful to keep her steps from breaking the stillness. Through a gap between two willow trunks, she saw a figure. Elias Kane sat with his back to her, his broad shoulders hiding half the firelight. The fire itself was small, neat, ringed in low stones, burning just enough for warmth, not large enough to announce itself to the whole town. The light glanced across his face as he tilted slightly, revealing eyes fixed intently on what he held in his hands. It wasn't a knife, not a half-carved piece of wood. It was a thick book, its leather spine worn and scuffed, its pages yellowed with age. When he turned a page, his hand moved slowly, his forefinger tracing lines of script that were not in English. The curling, intricate characters looked like the markings carved into ancient stone. In an instant, Clara recognized them. Greek. The wind stirred a few strands of his hair, and the firelight carved the lines of his cheek and jaw in sharp relief. The sight was nothing like the first impression she'd had of him. The towering man stepping down from the saddle with blunt words and the rough edges of any hired hand in the West. Here, in the dark with the fire's glow, He looked as if he belonged to another world, a world of books, of languages older than the hills. Clara stayed behind the willow, letting the image settle deep into her memory. She watched his finger pause on a line, holding there for several breaths, as though weighing it, then turning the page with care. Now and then he would lift his gaze from the book to the fire, not idly, but as if fitting what he had just read into some larger chain of thought already in place. Beside him, his saddlebag lay open, not showing a gun or a blade, but a few more books, their covers protected with waxed cloth. Next to them sat a tin kettle tilted on the stones, steam curling from its spout, carrying a faint scent of mint, the kind of trail tea made by someone who knew how to prepare it. Clara felt the ground beneath her feet soften, as if her whole weight leaned toward the scene. The silence here was unlike the silence in town, where people stayed quiet to avoid saying what they truly meant. This was the kind of silence that made you want to linger, just to keep watching. She didn't step out to greet him, didn't want him to know she was there. Perhaps she feared breaking the moment, one he himself might not even know he was making. A moment of contradiction, where strength and learning lived side by side in the same man, neither overpowering the other. The wind carried the smoke closer, threaded with the fire's warmth. On the water, the flames stretched into long streaks of orange gold, shattering into pieces as the current pulled them away, each piece like a small fragment of time leaving this place forever. Elias leaned, setting the book down just far enough from the fire that no ash would touch it. He poured tea into a tin cup, his movements slow and certain. When he lifted it to his lips, the rising steam blurred part of his face, but his eyes stayed on the page, as if reading and drinking were parallel acts, one never interrupting the other. Clara stepped back, her toe brushing against a willow root that rose above the soil. The coolness of the wood under the thin skin of her foot grounded her. She realized she had stood there longer than she'd intended, stilled like someone caught in a scene that didn't belong to them yet didn't want to leave. She made her way back the same way she had come, careful not to make a sound. All the while, the image of Elias by the fire stayed sharp, his finger tracing Greek script, the light on his face, the open book like a door into a life she had never imagined a man like him could have walked through. When she reached the porch, Clara stopped, leaning lightly against the post. From here, the firelight was no longer visible through the trees, but another kind of light remained in her, one not from the flames, but from the quiet surprise of discovering that Elias Kane's world was far wider than the long shadow he'd cast across her yard that first day. And it was that knowledge, silent yet certain, that made her heartbeat change. In a place like Dry Willow, rumors never need a clear starting point. They slip out of hesitant words, ride the steam from morning coffee, then settle into the nods of passers-by. At the small cafe on the corner of the main street, its warped porch roof having sheltered countless conversations no one dared put to paper, the clink of spoon against cup rang sharper than usual that morning. Clara wasn't there, but she knew exactly what the cafe was like at that hour. The door cracked just enough for the breeze to slip through. The scent of strong brewed coffee tangled with the smell of toasting bread. A few cracked leather chairs leaning toward their counterparts, as if urging their occupants to draw closer. Outside, the hitching post creaked in the wind, while inside a fresh rumor had already grown legs, walking from table to table. "A federal marshal just rode in from the east," someone said low, but not so low that it couldn't drift to the next table. "Looking for a real tall fellow, used to be in Boston. Tied up in things best left alone." No one asked what things right away. Here, it's the space between words where imagination takes root, and that space widens when it concerns someone who has yet to belong to the community. Within half a day, the rumor seeped out of the cafe, into the general store, the post office, and among the knots of men gathered outside the blacksmith's. From there, it became a look. Not an outright glare of suspicion, but enough for Clara to notice the difference when she came into town. People looked a little longer toward the dirt road that led to her property, and longer still at any tall rider passing through. Elias still appeared where he needed to, leading his horse to the creek, buying supplies from the smithy. But now his steps carried a dense hush around them. Folks stopped talking when he came near, or if they didn't, their voices dropped and their talk shifted to crops or the price of timber. That silence, though not confrontational, pressed in like a tightening loop of rope. One afternoon, Clara went to the creek for water and saw Elias on the opposite bank. He didn't come over, only bent to tighten a saddle strap, his eyes flicking briefly toward town. In the light slanting through the birches, his face didn't change, but his shoulders lifted slightly. A small movement Clara knew was the sign of a man weighing something. She didn't ask, not because she didn't want to know, but because in this land, sometimes silence is the only way to keep an uncertainty from being torn into a dozen worthless pieces. But rumors don't need truth to live. All they require is repetition, and in Dry Willow, there was always someone ready to repeat them with a little extra spice. Some mentioned trouble with the law back east. Others added something to do with the war. Each hand that passed the story along pressed it into a shape that fit its palm, so that by the time it reached another ear, it had taken on a new form. Clara began to notice a different kind of movement in town. At the post office, she saw a stranger in a dark, heavy coat, hat pulled low, speaking quietly to the clerk. At the smithy, someone glanced toward the door each time hoofbeats sounded. These scattered signs joined together in her mind into a kind of weather, a pressure in the air before a storm, not because clouds had gathered, but because the air itself had grown heavy. On Wednesday afternoon, while buying salt at the store, Clara caught a snippet from two men standing out front. One said, "This marshal won't be here long. Just needs to get the trail on that tall fella." Then they fell silent when they saw her. That cut-off silence, more than the words, confirmed that everything now circled a center she couldn't ignore. Elias, it seemed, knew more than he let on. When Clara ran into him near the north fence, he was repairing a post. The wind lifted a few early gray hairs at his temple, but his hands never stopped their work. She stood for a moment, about to speak, but instead said only, "That post hasn't been replaced in years." He gave a short nod, a flicker of a smile at one corner of his mouth, then bent again to his task. In the days that followed, traces of his presence around Clara's place still appeared, but he no longer left the kind of things that drew notice. No seed corn, no coiled rope, just a fence line suddenly firm, a water trough no longer leaking, the barn door shut tight each night. The help had grown quieter, as though he were drawing in, reducing the chances for anyone to mark his hand. The rumor kept breathing, not fast, not slow, but steady as the ring of a hammer on an anvil. Each strike was an extra look, a half-finished sentence, an unnatural pause. And like a hammer's rhythm, it didn't have to be loud, only steady enough to wear itself into the ear. One fogged morning, Clara returned from the fields to find a fresh hoofprint near the gate. It wasn't from Elias's horse. The mark was smaller, neater, the shoe newly set. Beside it, in the dirt, was the clear impression of a black-heeled boot. The print pointed towards her town, as if someone had stood here, looking at her house, before turning away. Clara stayed there for a long moment, ears tuned to the wind through the fence rails, eyes on the dirt road until it slipped from view. She knew she wouldn't tell Elias. Not yet. But she also knew that from now on, every step he took would be counted, every appearance etched into the collective memory of a town waiting for the story to end, one way or another. Rumors often start as a thin wisp of smoke, but by the time Clara had gathered enough fragments from enough directions, it was a full blaze. Each scrap of story was an off-key note, yet when she pieced them together, they played a complete melody, one no one truly wanted to hear in full. Elias had once been a mathematics professor in Boston, something hard to believe if you looked at his calloused hands, sun-darkened skin, and the frame of a man more used to the saddle than the lectern. But the more she thought about it, the more she saw the traces still there, hidden in the way he measured each span when setting a fence post, or cut a board to fit without needing to measure twice. What she heard next went beyond teaching. Elias had opened his classes to students the schools refused, not for lack of ability, but because of skin color, birthplace, or simply because they did not belong by the ruling hand's definition. He taught them mathematics, but also how to read maps, how to understand the numbers hidden in topographical charts. Then the war came. At a time when everything was divided into right side and wrong side, Elias chose a path that made both wary of him. He never carried a rifle, but he used his knowledge to design escapes, routes through forests, makeshift bridges, shallow crossings, for those being hunted. They could have been deserters, their families, or anyone caught in the no-man's land between politics and gunfire. When Clara heard this, it felt like holding a heavy stone in her hands. To keep it was dangerous, because if even part of the truth came out, Elias would be pursued not only by rumor, but by the full weight of the law. Yet to drop it would be betrayal, because if she let it fall into the ears of those who meant him harm, it would be as good as pushing him into their circle. She remembered the first time she'd seen him by the fire, his finger tracing Greek script across a page. Back then, she had thought it only an intriguing contrast, a frontier man with the knowledge of a distant world of scholarship. Now it was a perfect puzzle piece. Those symbols could be maps, ciphers, or simply the habit of a man who had lived many years with numbers as his only constant companion. The talk of a federal marshal in town now carried a sharper edge. If the man truly sought Elias, the reason surely ran deeper than involved in things best left alone, as the cafe chatter had claimed. Clara began to notice more. The unfamiliar boot prints by her gate the other morning, the quick flicker of a gaze away when she caught someone looking toward her land, and the pockets of unnatural silence whenever Elias was near. One afternoon, while stacking flour sacks in the storeroom, Clara heard hoofbeats in the distance. She stepped onto the porch and saw Elias riding in from the west, his back straight, face composed as if nothing could throw him off balance. But as he dismounted, he scanned the yard, quickly, a short, subtle motion that might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. She knew it for what it was, the reflex of a man used to living under someone else's aim. Clara wanted to ask outright, but the words caught in her throat. Here, asking too much could fracture trust more fragile than the thin ice on a winter stream. Instead, she set a water jug on the table and remarked that the night would turn colder. Elias only nodded, his gaze meeting hers just long enough for her to understand that he knew she'd learned something. The next day, she noticed he was replacing the lock on the storeroom, not because it was broken, but because someone had tried to force it. Fresh scratches around the keyhole gave it away. He said nothing, only fitted the new lock, slipped the key into his pocket, and carried on as though nothing worth mentioning had happened. But it was that silence that made Clara all the more aware. His past was drawing closer, not in strides, but in the patience of those willing to wait for their moment. That evening, the wind rose, carrying the smell of smoke from somewhere beyond town. Clara sat at the table, lamplight throwing her shadow against the wooden wall. She opened a ledger, pretending to write farm notes, but in truth, she was calculating in her mind. If one day Elias vanished, where would she go to find him? And if he were taken, what could she say to make anyone believe that a man who had helped others escape was not a criminal? The thought stilled her hand on the page. This was no longer about a stranger who had happened to help her. Elias, with his wordless acts, had worked himself into her life the way breathing works. Quiet, unobtrusive, yet leaving a hollowness if gone. Now, knowing part of his truth, she also understood that his presence here was not mere chance, but a delicate balance between past and present, between freedom and the ties that threatened it. Clara closed the ledger softly, rose and fed more wood into the stove. The flames leapt higher, throwing a light that was both warm and resolute across her face. Perhaps keeping Elias's secret meant learning to live with the weight of it, like keeping a rare bird while knowing it could take flight at any moment. Outside, a solitary set of hoofbeats echoed in the night. Not Elias's, and not anyone from town she knew. Clara stood by the window for a long while, her hand resting lightly against the frame, listening as her heartbeat slowed and deepened. She knew, at that moment, that Elias's past was no longer somewhere far away. It was out there now, in the dark and the fog, finding its way to the door. That afternoon began like any other in autumn here. Sunlight stretched in long golden threads toward the day's end, the wind carrying the scent of dry hay and stove smoke from the wooden houses. Clara had just pulled a batch of bread from the oven, the smell of flour and yeast still clinging to her sleeves, when the church bell began to ring. Fast, urgent, nothing like the call to service. From her porch, she looked toward the center of town. A column of gray smoke was rising from the roof of the council hall, twisting in layers, thickening by the moment. The wind pushed it sideways over the main street, curling around low rooftops, swallowing the last of the sunlight. People were running in all directions, shouting names, children crying, boots striking the ground in a frantic rhythm. Clara untied her apron, pulled her shawl close, and hurried toward the growing crowd. When she arrived, she saw how bad it was. Flames had already devoured most of the roof, licking across the dry boards like paper. The main doors were jammed, iron hinges warped by the heat. Someone had tried ramming them with a shoulder, but only managed to send more fire and smoke bursting out. Inside, voices cried out for help, children sobbing, old men coughing. Families had come with their little ones for this afternoon's community meeting, and now they were trapped. No one knew quite what to do. A few men ran for water, but a couple of buckets were no match for a fire like this. Then glass shattered, sharp and final. Every head turned toward the side window. Elias Kane, his coat thrown to the ground, stood with a heavy beam in his hands, having smashed the frame. In the next breath, he was climbing through. No one had time to call out before the smoke swallowed him whole. Seconds later, he emerged, carrying a soot-streaked child coughing into his chest. He passed the boy to a screaming mother and went back in without pause, without a word. The second time he brought out an elderly man, supporting him under the arms, ducking low to avoid the falling, ember-hot rafters. The third, he led out two sisters clinging so tightly to each other, their knuckles were white, their hair tangled with ash. The crowd began to understand what to do, forming a line by the window to take whoever Elias brought, freeing him to turn back faster. Men who'd once kept their distance from him now moved in to help, forgetting every rumor they'd whispered before. Each time Elias reappeared, his face was darker, eyes red from the smoke, his breathing short and heavy. But his steps never slowed. Sweat and soot formed a layer across his neck and forehead, and the left shoulder of his shirt was singed. On the final trip, when the flames had claimed nearly the entire roof, Elias came out carrying no one. In his arms was a heavy canvas sack, the mouth stitched shut. He set it down, coughing hard. Only later did people learn it held all the land deeds, tax records, and ledgers of the Saumur town, documents that could never be replaced if lost. He said nothing, only pulled his coat back on and stepped aside, letting the crowd tend to those who had been saved. Clara stood a few paces away. She had never seen him like this, not only because he had saved so many lives, but because he had stepped out of the silence he always kept, letting the whole town see who he was. Before, Elias had been a shadow glimpsed while repairing a fence, the man who left a sack of seed corn on a doorstep, the solitary figure reading Greek by a fire. Now he was the man who charged into an inferno, knowing each entry might be his last. By the time the fire was under control, the sky had turned purple. Clara found Elias behind the feed barn, sitting against the horse trough, his hands trembling faintly from exhaustion and smoke. She brought him a bowl of water. He didn't drink right away, just held it as though drawing warmth from it, though the water was cool. They didn't speak of the fire. They didn't need to. Something between them had shifted. An unspoken distance burned away to nothing. That night, Clara went home with the smell of smoke still in her shawl. In the dark, she understood that from this day forward, if anyone came to hunt Elias, it would no longer be easy for this town to turn its back on him. And for her, the fire had burned down the last wall between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of silence. The smoke from the fire still hung in the air, tangled with the scorched scent of burnt timber and the damp cool of the fading afternoon. Clara stood on the council hall steps, scanning the faces, directing people to move in orderly lines, sending the injured toward the cafe where the owner had already laid out blankets and set water to boil. She gave instructions the way her late husband had once taught her to build a bridge in the rainy season, short, firm, and without hesitation, because in moments like this, even a single breath of uncertainty could bring the whole structure down. In the chaos, Clara caught sight of Elias at the edge of the crowd. He was carrying the last child, a boy no more than 6, curly-haired, his face streaked with soot, but eyes wide with fear. Elias placed the boy into his mother's arms, offering only a brief, gentle smile before another movement caught Clara's eye. A tall man in a long brown coat, silver badge glinting on his chest. The federal marshal. He'd been there for some time, his hat brim shadowing his eyes, but Clara saw his hand clearly, resting on the grip of his revolver, not hurried, not hesitant, as though the few steps between him and his quarry were just a matter of form. The world around her seemed to draw taut. The voices, the crying children, even the crackle of fire somewhere in the remains of the building, all of it receded. There was only Elias, turning without knowing, and the marshal, closing the distance one even step at a time. Before she could think, Clara stepped down from the hall's porch and moved directly between them. Her feet touched ground still warm from the fire, but her voice came cold and clear. "He's my husband." The marshal stopped, just for a beat, but it was enough for the change to ripple outward. The crowd's murmur died as if someone had snuffed every candle in the square. Smoke-reddened eyes turned toward one point, waiting for what came next. Clara didn't look at the gun. She kept her gaze locked on the marshal's, as if she were speaking a truth that could not be argued. There was no defiance, no fear, only a statement placed into the air for all to hear. Elias stood a few paces away, his shoulders tightening. He said nothing, but the look he gave her was one she knew she'd carry for a long time, a mix of surprise, gratitude, and something else like the first time he'd let anyone stand beside him without suspicion. The marshal's eyes swept the crowd. He saw familiar town faces, people who, days ago, might have listened to or even repeated the rumors about Elias. Now they stood closer to him, not a single one shifting toward the lawman. They'd just seen him save their children, their parents, and the records their town needed to exist. In that moment, the lines had moved. Elias was no longer an outsider, and Clara, with one sentence, had redrawn the map of who stood on which side. The marshal's hand slipped away from the revolver's grip, not in surrender, but in postponement. His voice was low, no longer cold. "I'll be back." Clara gave the smallest nod, as though she accepted the truth of that. Because she knew Elias's past could not be erased by a single afternoon, any more than a fire could be put out for good with a few buckets of water. But she also knew that from this day on, if they came to take him, it would not be easy for a bullet or a pair of irons to close this story. The marshal turned his horse and rode out slowly, the dust from its hooves drawing a faint line across the purpling sky. Clara turned back to Elias. He was still there, drawing deep breaths as if trying to clear the last of the smoke from his lungs. His eyes met hers, and this time didn't look away. No words passed, but both of them knew. The choice she'd made had pulled their fates closer together, in a way no fire or gun could break apart. That night, as Clara closed up the bakery, she saw a figure at the far end of the street, leaning against a lamppost. Tall, dark coat, eyes fixed toward Elias's door. Maybe the marshal hadn't gone far. Or maybe Elias's past was like smoke, blown on the wind, but leaving its scent in the air. Clara wasn't afraid. She slid the bolt across the door, snuffed the lamp, and let the darkness keep their secret for one more night. The next morning, the sky looked scrubbed clean. Wisps of thin cloud drifted high, letting the first light glint off beads of dew clinging to the wooden fence rails. Clara opened the bakery earlier than usual. The warmth from the freshly stoked stove carried the rich scent of flour and yeast into the street. But this morning, that wasn't the only thing drawing people in. The first to step inside was Mrs. Whitlow, a woman known for keeping her door shut tight and avoiding anything that might turn into a long conversation. She carried a folded handkerchief, and inside it, a neatly creased slip of paper. She didn't order bread, as she usually did. Instead, she spoke quietly, her breath hanging in the cool air between them. "For him, and for you." When Clara unfolded the paper, she saw Mrs. Whitlow's signature on a petition addressed to the governor, requesting a pardon for Elias. Without another word of explanation, Mrs. Whitlow set her hand briefly on the counter, gave it a small squeeze, and turned to leave, her slight frame moving with a firmness Clara had never noticed before. The news spread as quickly as wind over the open prairie. By midday, 7 families had come. Each brought something: a basket of eggs, a bundle of carrots, a loaf of dark bread. But most importantly, they added their names to the petition, each in a different hand, each clear in its intent. Clara recognized many faces that had once avoided her on the street, people who had looked away when their eyes met Elias's in the cafe. Now they not only met her gaze, but lingered at her gate, speaking of the fire the day before, of how Elias had carried the children out as if they were his own. People who once spoke of him in low, cold tones were now using the words, "one of our own," without stumbling. By noon, Clara carried the bundle of petitions, now with nearly 30 names, to Elias's place. He was in the backyard, crouched to tighten the reins on his mare. When he saw her, he stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and waited for her to speak. "These came in this morning," she said, handing him the papers. Elias took them, his eyes moving down the page. The sunlight caught the blotched ink of each signature, each name an improbable proof. He was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "I wasn't expecting this." Clara smiled faintly. "They've been expecting you for longer than they knew." That afternoon, when Clara returned to the bakery, she found a basket of red apples left on the doorstep, with a hastily written note. "For the man who carried my child out of the fire. God bless." No signature. None needed. The next day, the town seemed subtly different. At the cafe, when Elias stepped inside, a few nodded in greeting instead of looking away. At the blacksmith's, the old smith rose from his chair, pointed to a new saddle, and said that if Elias needed it fitted, he'd do it free of charge. The gestures were small, but to a man who had lived, for years in the shadow of his past, they were like the first beams of light through a long, locked room. Elias never said so, but Clara noticed him standing longer on the porch, eyes on the street as if listening for something new. That evening, Clara received another petition, this one bearing the signatures of the school principal and the town's pastor. She knew that once they'd signed, others would follow. Sending the petition to the governor was no longer the idea of a few individuals. It had become the shared voice of a community. Of course, not everyone changed. Some still kept their distance, still took the long way around when Elias was near. But Clara understood. Every community has its shadows that take longer to move. What mattered was that the light had been lit, and now it was spreading from porch to porch, street to street. A week after the fire, while Clara was tidying the counter, a little blonde-haired girl ran in and placed a small, paper-wrapped bundle of cookies on the table. "Mama says these are for you and him, and she says, tell him not to go anywhere." Clara bent down, met the girl's clear eyes, and nodded. "He'll listen to you." When the child skipped away, Clara felt something she hadn't in a long time. That hope was no longer as fragile as a single thread, but had been woven into something thick enough to cover the two of them, even while the cold wind still blew across this land. That morning, sunlight fell through the window in narrow gold threads, spilling across the wooden table where Elias had already laid out a stack of papers. They weren't new documents. They were old bank statements, loan contracts, and tax receipts, edges yellowed, carbon copies so faded they had to be tilted into the light to be read. He'd gotten them from an old friend at the registry office and brought them back quietly, spending night after night combing through each figure. Clara leaned against the doorframe, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. She watched as he drew pencil lines across the page, striking through inflated interest charges, not saying a word. He made notes in the margins about sums rounded far too generously, about service fees that existed nowhere in the original contracts. Mathematical symbols began to appear like a kind of code, but for Elias, they were an old language, one that had once saved lives and now was saving land. "You found it then?" Clara asked, her voice low but steady. Without looking up, Elias ran his finger down a column of numbers. "They've been miscalculating for nearly 10 years. A little each time, but it adds up to half the ranch. If this goes to court, they'll have to return it." She stepped closer, resting her hand on the back of his chair. The mingled scent of old paper, ink, and the morning's fire made the room feel as though winter had never touched it. That afternoon, Elias went to the bank with Clara. The manager, who had never hidden his coldness toward them, looked displeased to see the thick folder in Elias's hands. Elias set it on the desk, opened to the first page, and began pointing out each violation, each figure altered outside the law. His voice was low and steady, without threat, but each statement landed like the closing of a door that wouldn't open again. At first, the manager tried a thin smile, offering vague excuses about internal policy and standard procedure, but Elias had come armed for this. From his coat pocket, he pulled a copy of the state's banking statutes, pointing to the exact clause on interest calculation and the rights of landowners to dispute charges. His fingers moved down the text the way he might read a book in Greek, slow, deliberate, not missing a word. Clara sat silently beside him, watching for the moment the manager's face shifted from dismissal to caution. It came when Elias cited a case from 3 years earlier in the neighboring county where the plaintiff had won on this very law. By the end of the meeting, the manager had no choice but to sign a statement admitting fault, agreeing to return the overcharged funds and canceling any move to seize the land. Clara left the bank with the rare feeling of a weight lifting from her chest. But the story didn't end there. Word of the ledger turning spread across town faster than the first spring wind. To many, it wasn't just a victory for two people. It was proof that the law, so often leaning toward the powerful, could be bent back into shape if someone knew how to work it. That was when the political wind shifted. The mayoral candidate who had once opposed the idea of a pardon for Elias now publicly voiced his support. He called their story a symbol of frontier resilience and justice, promising reforms to stop illegal foreclosures. Many doubted his motives, but no one could deny that his statement changed the tone of the conversation. That weekend, when Clara opened the bakery, she found the local newspaper neatly placed on the step. On the front page was a sketch of Elias and Clara standing in front of the house, the headline beneath it reading, "From fire to courtroom, couple defends land with law and trust." She carried it inside and set it on the counter. When Elias stopped by later, he only glanced at it, his lips pressing into a thin line. But Clara felt his hand rest on the back of her chair a moment longer than necessary. Thanks unspoken, but understood. That night, they sat by the fire without many words. Outside, the wind carried the scent of fresh grass and the far-off sound of a barking dog. In the glow from the embers, the bank papers were tucked neatly into a drawer, not as a burden anymore, but as proof that Elias's past, once an excuse for suspicion, had become something that protected them. And for the town, This story would be told again, not just as a victory over a bank, but as a reminder that here on the frontier, justice isn't only in the written law. It lives in the hands of those patient enough to find it and strong enough to keep it. The school that had burned down had been rebuilt for nearly 2 months now. It was no longer the rough wooden shack it once was, but something sturdier, with wide windows that caught the full sweep of the morning light, new desks built by the town's own carpenters, and a small back room filled with supplies. Children once again gathered there each morning, chattering as they arrived with their books and small wooden boards, where they practiced drawing technical sketches alongside addition and subtraction. Elias did more than teach arithmetic, as one might expect of a former professor. He wove in principles of measurement, proportion, reading maps, and calculating materials. For the grown-ups, such skills could mean building a house, a bridge, or repairing a barn. For the children, it was a kind of game for the imagination, where they could design structures that didn't yet exist, but could stand firm if the math was right. Clara often stood outside the doorway, watching. She listened to the chalk scraping softly across the board, saw Elias lean just slightly so that a smaller girl could see better. Sometimes, when he explained something, his hand would idly turn a wooden ruler, an unconscious gesture of a man long accustomed to a lectern. And every so often, their eyes met across the open space of the room for only a second, but enough for her to know he had noticed her presence. At noon, when the children left, Elias would gather the chalk, brushing the white dust from his hands. Clara would hand him a sack of sandwiches and a canteen, and they would sit on the steps, trading a few words about the weather, the planting season, or a family newly moved in at the southern edge of the grasslands. They didn't need many words. The silences between them had become their own kind of language, the kind that only people who had stood together in the fire and walked out together could understand. Once, as she looked out over the fields, Clara remembered the first time she had met Elias. That dust-heavy, silent afternoon when he'd stood leaning against a post, eyes unreadable. She could never have imagined then that they would share moments like this, peaceful, with no accusations, no suspicious glances. Just two people sitting together, letting the sun do its work without needing to chase it or hide from it. In town, change spread slowly but steadily. More parents sent their children to school, not just to learn letters, but to learn how to measure so a house would stand strong, how to mark a field's boundaries so no land would be lost, or how to understand the numbers on a bank's ledger. Small things, perhaps, but here, such knowledge could mean the difference between surviving a winter and not. Sometimes someone would stop by the porch with a basket of eggs, a woven cloth, or an armful of dry kindling. They'd say it was to thank Elias for saving their child in the fire, or Clara for helping them understand a loan document, the song. Two never refused, but neither did they keep much for themselves. Most of it found its way to families in greater need. By night, the new school still smelled of pine and fresh paint. Moonlight spilled through uncurtained windows, silvering the clean blackboards. Clara knew these calm days were not forever. The West had never promised anyone lasting peace. But perhaps that was what made each evening on the porch, each turn of the wind across the fields, part of a memory no one could take from them. In the quiet, they had found something rarer than gold or land on the frontier. A stretch of time with no need to guard themselves, no need to prove anything, only the choice to remain. The stove had gone cold, leaving only the faint warmth from the coal bed and the lingering scent of half-burned pine in the air. Clara unrolled the blueprint for the new irrigation system across the table, the paper edges curling slightly after a day spent inside its bamboo tube. Under the oil lamp, the lines in charcoal and blue ink stood out clearly, small channels fitting into each other like veins, carrying water from the northern creek to the pastures and far-off plots that the dry season usually left cracked and barren. Elias stepped inside, sleeves rolled high on his shirt, the bandage on his arm still fresh from the council hall fire. He didn't sit right away, but stood at the head of the table, eyes following each line on the drawing, as if reading a familiar language that still required care. His good hand pressed down on the edge of the paper, keeping it from the night breeze, while the injured one rested lightly over it, as though shielding it from every wind that might try to carry it away. 3 seasons, he said quietly, voice deep like the ground after rain, and it will be finished. Clara looked up, the lamplight catching in her eyes. They didn't say what it meant, not just the irrigation project, but a part of the town's future, of the children growing up here, of land that wouldn't be left to wither with every drought. That promise wasn't carved with a date, but here, under this roof, it had become a silent marker in time they both understood. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wild mint from the edge of the fields, mingling with the chirr of summer insects. Most windows in town had gone dark, save for a few faraway lights, small fires adrift in a sea of night. Clara gathered the sheets, stacking them neatly, her hand falling without thought to the spot where Elias's had just been. The heat still lingered on the paper, fragile yet enough for her to feel. No one brought up marriage. There was no need. In Dry Willow, folks had long taken to calling them by the same surname, at first for convenience, then from habit, and eventually as an unspoken truth. When someone knocked and asked, "Are the McCraes home?" they'd simply share a glance, light as a door swinging open, and neither would correct it. At market days, Clara often saw young wives come to Elias for advice about building pens, running water lines, or measuring land. He'd answer patiently, pointing to numbers and lines as if they were the heartbeat of the earth. And when someone asked Clara how to keep ledgers, calculate interest, or file for seasonal aid, she did the same. Not lecturing, but placing the tools in their hands so they could keep what was theirs. Outside, the moon rose, casting their shadows side by side on the wall. In that light, the line between for now and forever blurred, just like their story, without a name, yet enduring. If this story finds you, in the silences, in the way two people can, stay without vows, leave a comment and tell me what you think. Have you ever witnessed such a quiet promise yourself? Hit like if you want more of these warm Wild West tales. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because perhaps next time we'll watch the first stream of water run through the new ditch of Dry Willow together.